Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel, Armor Studio NYC. Today we're going to do a Sherman restoration video. This Sherman is one of the first tank models I ever did prior to me recording and documenting my efforts. As you can see, it looks okay, but it's not really up to standards with my current state of modeling. So it's got some weird dust patterns, the finish is kind of off because of a lack of varnishing or surfacing. It's got some very boring colors, and as you can tell, it's been sitting on the shelf for a long time because it's very dusty. We're going to add a lot of stuff, including packs and tents from Value Gear, which are resin casted parts of very, very high details. You can see here, the detail is just beautiful. But let's take a look at this and let's take it apart. Very dusty, been sitting on the shelf. Weird dust patterns that don't really make a whole bunch of sense. The weathering in the suspension and wheels actually looks decent, but it still needs some work. I don't know what I went to go do with the tracks here, but that was my take on rust. So let's restore this model and let's make it so much better than what it currently is now. So again, as you can see, we use dry pigments for a lot of the weathering here. And at the time, dry pigments for me was a good idea. You just use some enamel thinner and you fix it to the model, but it lacks a little bit of depth. It also lacks the ability to kind of like streak. So it just ends up looking dusty. So we're gonna clean it completely off. We're gonna take it to the 1/35th scale car wash, and we're going to just take off all the sand, all the dry pigment that is still sticking around. Pretty much for this, I just put soap and water and I just blasted the model. As you can see, it's very, very dirty. It's not just dry pigments in there, that's dust and all types of other stuff. We're gonna want a clean slate, so we do our Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500, always in black for model tanks. And we're gonna do olive drab. I don't remember the color that it was originally painted in, but if you go back in the video, you can tell it was very dark. It was green with like black. It made really no sense at all. So I fast forwarded the base coating. I just went right to the post shading here. And the base color was olive drab with Tamiya buff. And now we're just gonna post shade with the pure color of olive drab. As always, you want to go relatively low air pressure, relatively close to the model, and you want to do this very like irregular pattern because weathering and everything else doesn't happen in a uniform pattern. You want to go section by section. I love this angle because you really get to tell the difference and how we're laying down the paint. It's not over splattering, it's perfectly thinned, nice up and close to the model, and I think it just looks pretty good right here. So next up, we're going to continue the post shading with more shades of olive drab and green. So we did the olive drab post shading, and now we're going to add this like vibrant green, which I wasn't really happy with at first, but after varnishing the model at the end, I actually think it has its place on this model, because greens, they fade into different colors. It may be a little bit more vibrant, it may be a little bit more subdued, but as you can tell here, some of the greens are very bright. It almost ended up looking like a camo pattern, like an unintentional jungle camo pattern, and I didn't really want that. So yeah, we made our own mixture of Tamiya grime, as I call it. It's a black and NATO brown. It's very close to black, but you could still tell it has some brown in it. This is one of my favorite parts of the modeling process right here, is just contrasting every corner, a lot of the angles, a lot of the bolts and rivets that you find. It differentiates the panels, and I think it gives the viewer specifically something else to really look at. You really kind of section off the model in a way that makes sense and is kind of logical. So weathering for each panel makes sense, and it draws your attention to a specific panel. What's interesting about this panel, what's interesting about the next one, and I think it just works really well. This works for any color model too. You could do green, you could do desert camo, you could do like a German gray, and it just adheres and it looks so natural, and it just gives your model that extra little bit of pop. And we're just going to continue this again for every panel. Check out the now painted stars that we have on the model tank. Did a little bit of chipping with them as well. Instead of decals, because I ran out of star decals, we used white paint and it looked pretty good. For these, I wanted to change the color of the gas cans, and I wanted to make them kind of like different. So I painted one in like this oxide red. I wanted to do that just because there was some debate on what were the color of gas tanks, so I just wanted to change it up. Here we have our value gear, wooden box, and some tarps and tents, and we're just going to hand brush these because they are small. I wanted the tarp to be like a gray. That was a little bit of a mistake, but I covered that up very quickly. And our tarps and tents will go into a khaki, pretty much like uniform color. Didn't want too much variation. We're going to continue the hand brushing here on these weathered tracks. Now, if you go back in the video and you look at the weathered tracks, they weren't really weathered at all. They were just painted black, which is the color of actual tank tracks, but I wanted to give these a steel rusted color. So we're going to cover this in gray, and then we're going to come back with our track wash later. We're going to dab the metal parts in flat white, and it kind of adds this ununiformed steel color. It's not going to make sense right now, and this looks like, what are you doing? But when you add the rust tones onto a surface that is different shades, so we have a gray and we have a pretty much a white here, and this is our track wash, you're going to see that it blends very well, and it actually looks fairly realistic. So once you cover this up with a track wash, then you get the desired effect that you really, really want. This is it's not a necessity, but it's something interesting to do that makes, you know, every metal bit different than the other one. And we do this with the tracks as well, or the spare tracks as well. You want to make sure you get every metal part too. In some way, I like the uniformity of that. Now comes to our favorite part ever of the modeling process, and that is going to be our weathering. We're going to use our thick acrylic mud paste, and we're just going to cover it all over the suspension and wheels and tracks. I mentioned this in the last video, however, I'll just go over it again. This acrylic mud paste can be diluted in water. It does have a gritty texture. The color does not really matter. We're not really going for the color. We're just trying to add the texture to the model. If you add too much, you could dilute it with water, and it still looks pretty good. You still get some pigmentation, very pronounced pigmentation, where you place the paint. So as you could tell here, we're streaking it up the back because the back should be the most dirty, and this actually makes the most sense for there to be streaking. This is a side or back panel that is uncovered, so the mud flips up and then it comes down as it rains or simply just because of gravity. And as you could tell, we're wiping away a lot of this stuff with water, and we still get a lot of that pigmentation, which is a really big advantage of using mud paste as opposed to trying to replicate fake mud somehow else. We want it very pronounced and we want it very weathered. We kind of don't want to go light here because we had light on the old model, and since this is a restoration, we're just going to go all in on the weathering here. And time to add some extra textures. So we're going to go back to our dried seaball grass, cut out some in scale grass, and we're just going to throw it on the suspension. If you look real quick, you can take a look at the tracks and how they rusted or oxidized with the white and the gray. I think it looks really, really good. You're gonna wanna do this for the entire run. I didn't add this to the wheels because I figured, well, you know, the wheels are constantly moving and the grass would fly off. But in the suspension, which is a non-moving part, or non-oscillating part, I should say, should stay there. We're gonna go back with our trick of the real dirt from our backyard, as well as more dried seaball grass, and we're going to fix it with the VMS sand and ballast freeze. This is an acrylic adhesive that doesn't leave residue, even though it does have kind of like a glossy tide mark, but you cover that with Tamiya buff, because we're all about clean slate here. We want a blank canvas so that way we can morph the colors into the way that we want. So as you see here, the muddy paste is obviously a very light tan, but the dirt up top is brown from our backyard. So we want to cover both in Tamiya buff, so that way we just have a blank canvas and then we can add the weathering later. This also allows a nice smooth transition from a heavily weathered portion to a not so heavily weathered portion. Weathering just doesn't reside and then cease to reside and then it's a nice clean tank. There's a certain gradual gradient to weathering. That's very important. It adds a lot of realism and it doesn't make it look like it is a plastic model any longer. It's okay if you have a little bit of overspray. It just really adds to that weathering that we're trying to achieve. And obviously the result is most prominent back here because we really do have that really abrupt space where the muddy paste dries, and it dries to just this solid like line, and we need to lighten that up. So here we can fill in any loose desired parts with the Tamiya buff, so that way there's not a lot of green showing. If we're going for heavy weathering, especially with the suspension, then you don't want a lot of green for the underpaint showing, simply because it just makes the weathering look that more realistic. So next up, we're finally going to add the color to our muddy paste and our dirt as well as our grass. So we're going to use these enamel washes. Now enamel is great because it has low surface tension, so it really gets into all these tight places that we really need it to. In between the rocks, in between the grass, in between the sediment of the muddy paste as well. But we're also controlling the color by going from lighter to darker. Watch out for some very satisfying moments here. As you could tell, it just covers all these parts that we really, really want. I feel as though I went a little bit too heavy with some of the weathering here. I feel like I probably should have went in smaller places, specifically on the wheels, not so much the suspension. But I feel like I could have differentiated that a little bit more. So something to keep in mind the next time I weather a tank. As you can tell there, that sediment, that texture on the suspension arm there was just something that I really, really appreciate just the muddy paste for. After we're done with our light brown, we're going to go to a more, it's not even really darker, it's just a medium brown. It's something that we didn't do on the last tank that I wanted to experiment with this time to add some different colors to it. So I added this medium brown and then I covered it with the dark brown. See a little bit of a difference, but the model is yours, so you are free to really cover it in whatever colors you like, as long as the colors kind of make sense to the model that you're trying to replicate. So for instance, in a desert cam vehicle, you're not going to add dark mud to a desert camo vehicle, you're going to add lighter colors. But for these, I figured France, Germany, you're probably going to have some darker shades of mud and dust going through the countryside, as well as some of the outskirts of cities. So as you can tell, we got a lot of really good variation in color here. We have our somewhat dusty color, we have a light brown, we have a medium brown, and then we have our dark brown wash coming into account here and helping us out. Just really change up the color and give the model something interesting to look at every step of the way. The other thing I really like about this weathering process is that no matter how, let's say you tried to be really uniform and really precise with everything, it just won't replicate itself just because of, you know, how different things fall. So you can see we did some light speckling because the fenders of this Sherman are pretty high. So again, we want to keep it nice and realistic. We are now adding our stowage to here. We're using Flexi 5K CA glue by VMS. This is a super glue that has small little rubberized textures in it, and what that allows us to do is it allows us a little bit more working time, and it also in black doesn't leave this white residual tide mark that regular super glue has. I also feel like this is a little bit easier on the model as well. We cannot forget the tracks in our modeling process, so we're going to actually use some thick mud from the Ammo Jimenez line, or MIG Jimenez line. This thick mud does have some sediment, but not that much as like the muddy texture that we use on the side, and this is pretty much just to cover the tracks and give it a real muddy texture that we can all appreciate and love. So guys, we are finally at the end of our journey, and comparing to how this tank used to look, I am so incredibly happy with how this tank looks now. There's a lot more texture, there's a lot more color variation, the weathering makes sense, which was the biggest pet peeve I had of this tank, as well as the color. This color looks a lot more realistic, even though it looks pretty bright here, it's just my lights, but it's just so much better in terms of color, rusting. The stowage, I think, is a nice little addition onto it as well. As always, thank you guys so much for your support. The channel is growing slowly but surely, albeit, but I cannot have done this without you guys. The motivation from your kind words are more than enough to keep this channel going and keep me modeling as well. I haven't said it in any other video, but please like, comment, subscribe, support this channel. It's free, and I think that's the best part about this channel right here. So if there's any other techniques or recommendations that you guys have, I would love to hear them in the comment section. If there's anything you want to see me build, I always try to respond to as many comments as I can, or as many inbox questions as I can. Thank you guys for coming by again, and just keep on modeling.